Teachers of Reddit, what was the most amusing cheating attempt you've come across? Story 1. My class has a student of the week who is allowed to create and display a poster about their interests in the front of the classroom. I was very impressed at the second grader who included all of the week's spelling words in his poster, since he knew it would be visible during the test at the end of the week. Story 2 had a kid copy her essay from like 20 different websites, like, ID make a Google search for one of the sentences in her essay, and a website with that exact sentence would pop up, do it again with another sentence, same deal, completely different website. She had somehow constructed a 3-page essay made up almost entirely of stolen content from various other essays, websites, news articles, none of which she cited in any way. By the end of the essay she had plagiarized half of the internet, and I was impressed still gave her a 0, but I let her redo the assignment. Story 3. Not a teacher, but I was a TA in a Spanish class. Spanish 1 students sometimes don't realize that you can't just write a paper in English and then feed it through Google Translate and copy-paste the result. The results of such an attempt were always a grammatical nightmare, but every once in a while something magical happens. When learning how to use the verb gustar, which very roughly translates into to like, one of my students had written I like to hang out with my friends on her paper before letting Google do its thing. Hey, race the thing about idioms that cannot be exactly translated. So when this student said I like to hang out with my friends, Google translated it to me gusta colgar afuera con mis amigos. For those who don't speak Spanish, this basically means I like to hang as in, by the neck outside with my friends. I could not stop laughing. A couple of commenters have mentioned that the exact translation of gustar is to please, and that me gusta effectively means it pleases me. That is a closer translation than to like, as I noted above. That is a very, very rough translation. However, it is not technically correct either. The most literal English translation of gustar would be to be pleasing to. This may seem like a minuscule difference, but it actually has a practical application. Sentence structure and pronouns. Gustar and encantar, for that matter, is always paired with indirect object pronouns, never direct. Since the me in me gusta is indirect, it means it is pleasing to me, not it pleases me. Source 6 years of straight as in Spanish, former TA, former professional tutor. Story 4. I was a student, and this kid once found the answers of a test beforehand and wrote the answers of the multiple choice answers on the top left of whiteboard. When the substitute teacher asked what it was, he said it was a 50-number long IP address. Yes, he got away with it. Story 5. One of the big tests I had to take in college was an American Chemical Society exam. It accounted for 25 of the grade. Because so many students had to take the exam, they scheduled at least 2 exams. I was in the first one. While we were taking the exam, which is supposed to be proctored, the professor stepped out. While he was out of the room, someone from the second exam group strolled into the room, picked up an extra exam, and strolled out the door. I don't believe he was ever caught. Story 6. Girl in skirt with answers written on upper, inner thigh. I am a guy. I can't confiscate her notes without going to jail. Nicely played, harlot, nicely played. Story 7. I am a teacher, but these happened when I was a student. During final year leaving exams, someone put a textbook in a plastic sleeve and hid it in the toilet cistern and innocently went to the bathroom to look up answers. There was another girl in my year who recorded herself saying her English essay really slowly and had it on her iPod with her headphones up her sleeve during our exam. Both so good, TBH, it almost seems earned. Story 8. Grade 1 spelling test. The boy brought in a list of the words and hid it under his test. We caught on to what he was doing when he had all of the words spelled correctly, but not in the order that they were called out. Story 9. Not a teacher, but my psychology prof told me that she once caught a student who wrote notes on a fruit roll-up and ate it during a midterm, not the wrapper, but the actual fruit roll-up. Story 10. I teach an introductory programming course at the local university. I require students to include a comment with their name in programs. I used to insert comments while grading, including a comment with the grade, and return the graded programs to the student. A student submitted multiple programs written by another student. Programs which I had already graded. The name and grade were left unchanged. Story 11. Not a teacher, but back in college, the professor and the TA inexplicably left the lecture hall during an exam. I saw so much unapologetic, active cheating during those 2 to 3 minutes. Like people were actively showing each other their test papers and you could hear people like actively talking to each other. It was amusing only because of how blatant some people were about it, up until they heard someone at the door and then everyone like shut up and pretended like nothing happened. Story 12. I have a thing called dermographism where if I get scratched, a painless red welt will form for a few hours. I used to scratch in answers on my inner forearm, and if I like I might be caught, I'd just scratch the entire area and cause my entire arm to redden, effectively erasing all the answers. Story 13. I'm not a teacher, but I work at the IT help desk at university. One of the parts of my job is assisting instructors professors with using our online portal for courses. Basically, they can use it to set up quizzes, assignments, exams, etc. We do have a few technicians who are admins and are able to go through activity logs and verify if students did try to submit assignments or not. One occasion, though a student received an error message that kicked them out of the exam and didn't allow them to take it, the student screenshotted it and emailed it to us. And our admins were unable to find anything in their logs to dispute the student's claim. However, one of our admins actually ended up looking at the properties of the image file the student had sent. He noticed that the date that file was created was about a day or so before the exam was due. It may have been created a day after. I don't remember the exact specifics. The timestamp on the actual screenshot was completely different from the one on the screenshot. It turned out the student had had a friend Photoshop a fake screenshot. Story 14. Back when I was TA for an introductory human evolution class ages ago, in the late 90s, we had several students one term who turned in their short papers using mystifyingly out-of-date and inaccurate answers to the questions, like 25 years out of date for theories and for factual information about fossils, genetics, and evolution. Like, the answers were so far out of date they were unrelated to our questions, like mentioning stuff that was not presented anywhere in our course and not mentioning stuff that was presented. The students, who turned in very similar papers, were all athletes in NCAA-type sports. All of the TAs involved, it was a big class, asked them, "Where did you get this information?" We were told, "We have an assigned study supervisor who helps us finish our homework," and that's what she told us. We advised them to have their study supervisor try reading the current textbook, lab manual and handouts, and they all got FS on their papers. Story 15. This was actually a colleague of mine. We were both TAs in a big lecture hall film class. One of his students plagiarized a paper by copying and pasting a film review. The thing is, when the guy copied and pasted it, pulled over all the screen caps and banner ads as well, and he didn't bother deleting them. Story 16. Not a teacher, but in my high school history class, someone wrote some answers on the backside of a water bottle label. Another kid in the same class etched the initials of all the presidents on his test pencil. Story 17. An art history teacher had told us a story about a girl who printed out his online notes super small and taped it to the nutrition facts on her soda bottle. He found out because she was very closely examining her drink during the final. Story 18. I used to write the equations very lightly with a calculator in between the buttons on my calculator. Never got caught and was the main reason I got 100 on almost all the tests in my high school math classes and physics class. Story 19. When I was a teacher aide for my computer teacher, I would grade the papers. 5 typed papers would come in. It was a keyboarding class. All with the same exact errors. They would swear up and down that they didn't cheat. But how stupid would you have to believe that 4 other people happened to make the same 10 mistakes as you? Story 20. Physics 100. At university, we are required to submit complete answers to the 10-question quiz at the end of each chapter in our thick text. Just as the course starts, I get a thick wad of photocopies in the mail with every answer to every question in the book neatly handwritten, including all the calculations and diagrams required. No return address, no request for 20 in later mail. I went through each answer to make sure I understood, and got 100 for that segment of my final mark. Never found out who or why. Story 21. I had 2 girls in my class, one smart, one special. I let them know about 2 weeks ahead of time the 6 essay questions that could be on their test, and then created 2 tests with a random set of questions. I made sure they each got a different tests. They both put down the same exact answers, even though they had 2 separate tests, with 2 separate sets of answers. I just let special fail, the smart one would ditch her eventually, and hopefully go on to bigger and better things. Edit special lazy, not special needs. Story 22. I'm not a teacher, but we do exams on computers, and one kid literally Googled every single question. Our proctor already knew, but she waited until the end on the exam time limit to go up to him and talk to him in private. I think he's being suspended for a few weeks for violation of academic integrity, but I don't know him personally. He's just an idiot. Story 23. Not a teacher, but when I was in high school, I modified one of these pens with a scrolling message and used it to cheat on vocabulary test for my French class. The teacher walked around the classroom during the tests and never suspected it. Story 24. Honestly, the thing I was most disappointed by when I started teaching at a college level was how really impossible it is to catch students cheating at a collegiate level on exams. Papers are easy. I taught AP labs and helped proctor the lecture exams. In those massive lecture halls, it is incredibly obvious to watch people cheating because you can clearly see them leaning over and talking to one another, or when the whole hall's cleared except for clusters of 2 to 4 people spread out apart the room, but short of finding a crib sheet, you can't prove them cheating. The best you can kind of do is come up and sit behind or next to them or walk up and say keep your eyes on your own test or something. In my lecture exams, I once had a guy who had pulled up like a Grey's Anatomy the book app up on his phone apparently. I kept trying to catch him and several people came up and told me, but he'd hide his phone whenever I came on his half of the room. I mean, it wound up the same as not. He got a 44 on the test, and at the college level, you can't confiscate a phone, and if you come up and ask, they can just deny having it. But honestly, I've only had one student in 8 years whom I knew was cheating on a test that passed. The best methods are either more work than studying would have been or don't get caught. Story 25. My friend and I have very similar handwriting and he happened to be sitting right in front of me, so after I completed the exam paper to the best of my ability, I slid my test paper under his chair, and he did the same with his. We then proceeded to correct and add to each other's papers. Story 26. I used to etch a small equation or 2 on the back of my hand with a mechanical pencil. ITLL fade from the irritated red color to slightly lighter than your skin tone. At a distance I imagine it would be near impossible to recognize, but it's pretty clear when you're right up on it. Story 27. Another story. Students are given a take-home exam. Ha, brilliant idea. Not, I could tell which passages to Google, based on how good the English was in the answers. I give some cheaters failing marks. One angrily accosts me after the results come out. Why did you fail me? I answer, well, I found significant portions of your exam were plagiarized from the internet, but it was at least 30 my own work. Story 28 Not a teacher. This was me when I was about 6 correction most likely 8 to 9 had a multiplication testable test. On one of the walls in the classroom was the full list of chart from 1 to 12, all being multiplied by 1 to 12. Someone finished, stood up and looked at the chart, blocking my view. So what do? Hey Dave, can you move? Story 29 In one of my college classes we were allowed to bring, and I quote, anything we can carry into the exam room in order to help us with the exam. He did tell us no computers or phones, but any notes were allowed. Well, one year he told us that a kid carried in a grad student on his back. The teacher allowed him to use the grad student to help because he thought it was so creative. Now he has a new rule: no computers, phones, or people. Story 30 Not a teacher, but a current high school student. Back in my sophomore year, I was taking my finals for Algebra 2. We get a good 2 hours for the test and I was quite prepared. I never study, I can just remember copious amounts of useless information. So around an hour and a half through the test my teacher sits down at the table next to me and starts to fill out the answer key for the test. I ended up getting a 98 on test purely because of this. I honestly can't believe she didn't notice me more or less blatantly cheating off of her. Story 31 Not a teacher, but still kinda on topic. A friend of mine got the answers for a Latin exam from some older kids who took the same text the year before, so he scribbles all answers down on his palm, and finishes the exam rather quickly. He hands it in, and as he's approaching the door, the teacher turns and asks, hey, you want a tic-tac? It should be painfully obvious what happened next. Edit. Apparently it's not exactly painfully obvious. As a reaction to being offered a tic-tac, my friend presented the palm of his hand, revealing all the answers he had scribbled on it, and busting him for cheating. Funnily enough, the teacher was cool with it. Henceforth, everybody just used the textbook to answer all exam questions. Story 32 Got a bunch of assignments turned in the other day for the notebook, which is 5 classwork assignments saved up for a month, then turned in together for the unit. One piece was a map that was supposed to be colored in and annotated. I got one from a student with most of the correct assignments, but he turned an MY map, the one ID used to show the class how to do it. Somehow it had been swiped off my desk. I guess he thought all maps look more or less alike. Story 33 I'm not a teacher and it's not really cheating, but recently we had a tort law essay due, and my lecturer emailed out that she would not be accepting pictures of crashed cars as proof of injury for deadline extensions. People were Googling pictures of crashed cars and emailing her attempting to extend their hand in dates. Story 34 When my friend was teaching, he would randomly shut the lights off during a test. Then he would look for the glow of a cell phone screen in people's laps, faces, etc. to see who was cheating. Story 35 Amusing, not sure, but there was this one guy, because his main language was not English, he was allowed to bring a dictionary into the exam. In the dictionary, the invigilator found handwritten notes relevant to the exam topic. The notes were in the student's handwriting. He was summoned before an academic tribunal. So there he is, this student accused of cheating, facing a 0 on the course, facing the wrath of his parents who had paid for him to study. In front of a half dozen or so of the academic staff of the college, you'd expect him to be, at least, slightly anxious, but no. He flatly denied that the notes were in his handwriting, even though they evidently were. He claimed that the dictionary was borrowed from a friend, and the friend must have written the notes, even though they were directly relevant to the exam. After about a half an hour we gave up arguing the technicalities of handwriting analysis, and just started arguing it doesn't matter how the notes got in the dictionary, you're not permitted to have this material, and you're going to get a 0 for the course, for another 15 minutes. Finally he got it or not. He asked what's my next line of appeal. We tried to explain there wasn't one, this committee was the final arbiter, so he rolled over and accepted his fate. Just kidding. He said that, in the face of our decision, he was going to sue the college to get his mark reinstated. We suggested he take it up with the college's CO. He did. It didn't do him any good, he still got 0. If there was a court case, I never heard of any. Another unrelated story, involving a different student from the same country. She was intelligent, hardworking, charming, the nicest person you could hope to have in your class. Neat handwriting even. I was advising her on her options for the next year, and I somehow misread her grades on a big spreadsheet printout. I said yes, you can get into XYZ course. Actually she couldn't, so what did this sweet, charming student do? She threatened to sue, because she had been mistakenly told she could get into such and such a course. Maybe she actually engaged a lawyer, because the college took it quite seriously. To make it worse, we couldn't actually let her into the course with her grades, because the entry criteria were not set by us, but by our academic partners. In the end, she was given a supplementary exam. Never just a charming, intelligent, sweet, cheerful book by its cover. Therein may be dragons. Story 36 I am a student, but one time the person in front of me tried to look at my paper during a test. I covered before he got anything, and after class when I asked him what he was doing he said he was reading my shirt. Story 37 Not a teacher, but a student. When I was in the 8th grade 6-ish years ago, my history teacher told us we could make a sticky note of cheats for our final exam. This was under the assumption we could fit just a couple of things on it. I asked her, is it fair if I just write the whole study guide on this? She told me it was impossible. So I got home, got a magnifying glass, and went to town fitting a 2-page study guide on a post-it note. She was impressed and let me use it. I got a 100. Story 38 High school teacher here. I was going to be absent one day for a dentist appointment, but didn't want to give busy work and put off a test, so I left it with a sub. I had already written it do the multiple choice answers were ABCD, etc., just to mess with them a little bit. I printing out an answer key and left it on my printer face down. Unbeknownst to anyone else, the answer key I left on my printer had DCBA, etc. I made sure that every single answer in it was wrong. Trues were false. The vocabulary matching was jumbled. Every answer was wrong, and if they bothered to read the questions and answers, they'd see it was obviously wrong. I came back the next day and found the answer key right where ID left it. Then, I told each class what happened. Inevitably, the kids who thought they'd pulled one over on me got a low-key panicked look. Sure enough, 3 kids had perfect zeros, low score possible. When I gave those test papers back, none of them challenged it because they knew what they had done. If a parent had said something, I'd have explained that they must have picked up an answer key for a different test in an attempt to cheat. I teach multiple courses, after all, so it's not my fault the geography student stole a world history answer key. TLDR 3 freshmen failed a test because they stole a bogus answer key. Story 39 Not a teacher, but one of my teachers gave us our final exam with an option. He had pinned the answer key to the ceiling, and on each desk was a bag of marshmallows and a box of toothpicks. We could use that to attempt to dislodge the key from the ceiling. About half of the people started trying to make long sticks with the marshmallows, and most of the other half said screw it and sat down and started taking the test. While I was laughing at the people making the sticks, I realized that the easiest way to dislodge the test was by getting the marshmallows melted into a big gooey ball and reinforcing it with a bunch of toothpicks for weight and rigidity. What I did next stunned the entire classroom. I walked under the ceiling tile foam and threw the ball as hard as I could. Ceiling tile popped out and dropped to the floor. I picked up the answer key and handed it to the teacher and asked for my A. Teacher was actually impressed, but decided not to touch my marshmallow spitball. Story 40 A girl went old school and wrote the answers on her hand. She was actually pretty successful, and she would have gotten away with it if she didn't decide to ask a question during the test, and raised her hand to do so. Story 41 This will probably get buried, but my friend and I used a system on multiple choice questions whereas I needed an answer I would tap X amount of times and he would respond with 1 to 5 taps for A, B, C, D or E. He would tap the same way, and if I had the answer I could respond back. A scratch with your pen was 0 and a pause meant multiple numbered question, like tap tap pause tap tap was 22. Story 42 Student wrote Black Boy was all about racism on his essay about the book Black Boy. He then proceeded to talk about racism hoping I'd glance over it and think he understood the themes of the book. Ironically, he provided no evidence and his essay proved to me he had not read the book. Which means the only real racist thing he learned was that he was racist. He assumed a book called Black Boy was only about racism. It has a lot of complex themes beyond that. Story 43 Not a teacher. In all of my calculus classes for engineering school, a group of my friends and I would meet up to type in example problems and equations on our graphing calculators. In a couple calc classes they wouldn't allow graphing calculators for the tests, however, we would need a blue book for our exams. I heard and saw a couple of my classmates writing very small equations in their blue book before the exam. I soon followed. I sat directly in front of the professor and he didn't even notice because he was either on his phone laptop or grading other classes' exams. Story 44 Not a teacher but a kid in one of my high school classes made a cheat sheet. Not too out of the ordinary until he got caught. Teach Ryan, what's that you got there? Ryan eats entire cheat sheet. Teach what are you doing? Spit that out. Ryan gulp. Teach that's it you're going to the principal's office. Ryan for what though? I don't have anything. Story 45 Not a teacher and late to the party but I have to share out of pure excitement and lack of effort many of you put into cheating. Some are great, however this is an art form and I was Pablo. It started when my teacher asked me to open a window. I did. That night I woke up with the realization I never closed the window. Keep in mind this was a portable room so it had sliding windows and not the high vertical windows with no room to shimmy in. After deciding to drive to the school out of curiosity or OCD I found it closed. Janitors probably. The next day I undid the latch, slid it a centimeter open and re-closed the latch making it appear closed. Drive back at night, park across the street, and run up to the building, still open this time, climb inside to rummage through teacher's desk and find the holy grail of answer keys for the next several tests. Did this many times over the course of the years following, but I figured if I was the sole outlier it would draw suspicion to me or at least unwanted attention. To combat this fear, I began handing out test answers to my classmates. Eventually it got to all of them. The smartest thing I did was to change a small number of correct answers to incorrect answers on the ones that got shared. Class average was still in the 90s for an AP class that normally had to be curves to get anyone in the A range. This was wildly successful, and while it created a skeptical teacher, nothing ever happened to me. By the end, word had gotten around, and kids actually wanted to start coming with me just for the thrill. Cue the creation of the B gang. Was this enough? Was I not entertained? No, I had to find a way to get into the classrooms with the incredibly high and tiny windows that are opened only a few inches by use of a long pole hook. Tried ladders, tried grapplers, and even tried the smallest kid in the class. Nothing could get in. My solution, getting caught. One night I let a janitor catch me trying to break into a room after house. I can't remember the exact excuse I used, but it must have worked since he pulled out his master key to let me in, and I pretended to grab what I had left, misdirection. I had already gotten what I wanted when he fumbled through the endless ring of keys to expose the master key to my eyes. One key for a majority of the rooms. There was now sheer determination to get a copy of that key. Come lunchtime the next day, one student literally tried to bribe a janitor into selling him the key to make a copy. No go. He even got reported, and fears the jig was up quickly spread. I waited and waited several weeks for this all to die down. Until one day after the school was closed and janitors cleaning up, I found my time to strike. He hung the keys back on his push cart and entered the room to clean. I had probably less than 30 minutes before he would move to the next. Swooped the key, took it to a friend of a friend who happened to work at a home improvement store and slipped him 50 to make a copy of the do not copy key. Returned the key with nobody none the wiser. I now had full control of everything. I was quiz god, test guru, the guy you needed when you were in a bind. I did my work through my crew, never letting even my best friends know that I was the ringleader of this entire show circus that circulated. Kids began offering larger, better, more exuberant bribes to get answers for their specific classes. It didn't always work as not all teachers kept answer keys, but where there was not a key, there was a blank test and a smart kid willing to complete it the day before. This was epic, but it would all end. I started teaching how I got away with it for so long, because you may have all the answers but memorizing them is a. My secret was a hole cut in the cuff of my jackets and headphone ran through the seam of my jacket connected to an iPod which had recording of my voice repeating the answers. All I had to do was look bored or sleepy, lean my head on my hand, and listen to the sweet sounds of success over and over. It got to the point where we would organize sit-downs in classrooms the night before tests with groups of kids. Just because we could. When my name started circulating and requests grew, I decided to ditch the do good by other motto, and retired from the game. To this day when I run into kids from my school, I get thanked for scholarships, acceptances to colleges, all from the amazing grades they received. It may all sound far-fetched, but I assure you this was very real, very fun. I got to college and failed out my first year. TLDR cheaters don't always prosper, but pull a little BNE, and you'll sure as be popular. Story 46. One time I got the answers to a test from a friend who took the class the previous semester, all multiple choice. Teacher allowed us a note card, so I started every sentence on the note card with the correct letter of that question. Got a 100 on that. Story 47. Anyone else ever create a program in their calculator that didn't actually function but had a bunch of test info in it, so then you just went into edit program mode during the exam and it would pull up all the information you had wrote in there? Story 48. In 9th grade ed, my school does a quiz where the girls are given a diagram of female anatomy, and the boys, male anatomy. One girl copied off of the boy sitting next to her. Story 49. My SO teaches kindergarten students and she had a little girl come in wearing her mother's bra, also being a young child who didn't even need a bra. This was quite the scene and she hid her answers to the spelling test in it. When my SO went over to her to ask what she was doing, the little girl was clearly cheating, but my SO was trying to go about it nicely. The little girl said my boobies grew so fast I needed this. Funny times. Story 50. Well, this one time my sister and her friend, who we'll refer to as M, had different English teachers and had to write an essay on the same subject. Ms. Teacher used that Turnitin website and my sisters didn't, so they used the same essay no problem. The next year my sister's other friend, I'll call her B, has the same teacher as M, and had to write to the exact same essay topic. My sister says yeah, just use mine. ITLL work, not realizing that it would get caught. M and B really didn't know each other that well, and of course their essays came up as the same. Somehow, they both managed to not get in major trouble. Oddly enough, I have the teacher, the one that uses the Turnitin site right now, and she tells this story to all her classes. Story 51. I am not teacher, however I had a friend who was quite a good programmer, so what he did was he reprogrammed his calculator to have all the answers he need for the exam on there, and he also changed so it looked like normal calculator. However, it had a CAS on it so he could do difficult maths equation without having to work it out. He never got caught, and it was a graphics calculator. Story 52. I'm currently just finishing up as a teacher here in Korea. Sadly, I had no crazy cheating stories, but one stuck with me for years from secondary school. We were studying the Russian revolutions and our history teacher, fun teacher, but you'd never want to cross him, called in one of the kids from 2 years below. Didn't know him personally but understood he wasn't the sharpest tool in the box. He asks this kid to tell all of our class about the French Revolution since had written about it in his essay. Kid freezes and goes red. Followed up with this line, of course you didn't write it though, did you? Professor XXX of Oxford University wrote it and you copied it verbatim. As if I'd think a 15-year-old wrote it. We all realize what's going on. Burst into laughter. Kid storms out of the classroom. Teacher slams his hand on the desk and shouts got the, before phoning the office and having someone take the kid to isolation. Beautiful moment. Story 53. Hey race, the opposite side of things. I was in 7th grade, sitting in social studies class. My next class was science, where I had a huge project due. I wanted to draw in one last chart in the back of it because I wanted it perfect. I was that kid who studied like crazy, and I always did well on tests in class. That's what happens when you are a teacher's kid. I wasn't a shitbag. This is important. That day in social studies we had a test about Egypt. Well, I totally flew through it and made it I had studied my off the night before and I knew all of the answers. I decided to take out my science book and look through it to find a good chart I could put into my project. I started drawing it, and this is when the teacher lost her mind. She accused me of cheating in front of the whole class and failed me on the spot. Cue parent-teacher conference. My mom adamantly defends me, since she knew I wasn't a cheater. I was a good kid and I had studied with her the night before. Teacher still insisted I cheated. I had to take the test again, aced it, and she gave me a C. That was the policy if you had to retake the test IRC. Then I had to make a construction paper pyramid for extra credit to get my grade up. I still think it is total bullshit. And this happened back in 1997 in a teacher, but the girls in my class used to write the answers, or a study guide on their thighs. Eventually got caught because people were asking why they were lifting up their skirts up and down during the exam. Story 54. Not a teacher but a friend of mine tried to cheat in his Leaving Cert Irish state exams in a hilariously unsuccessful way. He prepared some essays and then dictated them into MP3 files. His idea was to run a single headphone butt up his sleeve so he could lean on one hand and transcribe his recorded answers with the other. You can see where this is going. He put the butt on his pen arm, so that he couldn't listen and write at the same time. It was hilariously distracting watching him try to listen, pause, write, play, listen over and over. He gave up after a while, and he didn't get caught. Academics wasn't his thing anyways. Now he's a session drummer in a recording studio and living the good life. Story 55. My colleagues and I got a huge kick out of this one. A bit of backstory first. 2 weeks ago we caught students sharing information about the conflict version of an exam, which we have early because the swim team was going to be out of town for the second half of the week. Even though they all explicitly signed the course honor code forbidding such sharing, the primary version of the exam was similar enough that we decided to reschedule the entire exam to 1 week later, since we didn't have time to write a new exam after we discovered the breach. We then required that all of the students write an easy on the importance of ethics and integrity in engineering, and give a real example of a time engineering ethics was violated and what the repercussions were. This was to be submitted before taking the exam, and they were told they would not receive their exam or their exam grade until it was submitted. I almost didn't read them and just checked whether each student submitted their paper. Many of you are probably guessing what happened by now. One of them submitted an essay that was almost word for word copied from the internet. TLDR student copied an ethics essay from the internet.